You find yourself staring at a decision that could change everything. Your heart races, palms sweat, and in that critical moment, your mind goes completely blank. Not because you lack intelligence or training, but because something fundamental in how you process reality is holding you hostage. You see the pieces, you know the facts, but you cannot connect them into the bigger picture you desperately need. You feel the weight of consequences bearing down, yet your thinking remains trapped in the immediate, the tangible, the concrete. This is not weakness. This is not stupidity. This is your cognitive architecture hitting a wall that most people never even know exists. And in that moment of paralysis, opportunities slip away, relationships fracture, careers derail, and lives take turns that can never be reversed. The frustration is suffocating because you know something is wrong, but you cannot name it, cannot grasp it, cannot overcome it. You are stuck, and the world keeps moving without you. Jean Piaget discovered something that would shake the foundations of psychology, education, and our understanding of human potential. He did not set out to explain why adults fail at critical moments. He was watching children play with marbles in the streets of Geneva, asking them questions that seemed absurdly simple. But what he uncovered was not about childhood at all. It was about a cognitive prison that millions of adults never escape, a limitation so invisible that people live entire lives without recognizing the bars around their thinking. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why intelligent, capable, educated people freeze when they need to think most clearly, why they cannot see solutions that seem obvious in hindsight, and why this happens at the worst possible moments. More importantly, you're going to understand how to recognize this trap in yourself and the specific path Piaget mapped to break free from it. This is not about learning faster or memorizing better. This is about fundamentally transforming the architecture of how your mind constructs reality itself. The year was 1917, and Piaget was working in Alfred Binet's laboratory in Paris, administering intelligence tests to children. He was supposed to simply record which questions children got right or wrong. But Piaget became obsessed with something everyone else ignored. He noticed that children of the same age made the same kinds of errors, not randomly but in patterns so consistent they suggested something profound about how human thinking develops. A 7-year-old child would insist that when you pour water from a short, wide glass into a tall, narrow one, there is now more water because the level is higher. The child could see the water, could watch the pouring, could even describe what happened, but could not grasp that the quantity remained constant despite the change in appearance. This was not ignorance or lack of attention. This was a fundamental limitation in how the child's mind structured reality. The child was trapped in concrete observation, unable to perform the mental operation of conservation that would allow abstract understanding. Piaget realized he was witnessing not a mistake, but a stage of cognitive development that every human passes through, and critically, that some never fully transcend. He spent the next 60 years documenting what he called the stages of cognitive development, a progression from reflexive action to abstract thought that unfolds in every human being. But the stage that haunted him, the one that explained more human suffering and failure than any other, was the transition from concrete operational thinking to formal operational thinking. This transition typically occurs between ages 11 and 15, but Piaget discovered something disturbing. A significant portion of the population never makes this transition completely. They remain cognitively capable of handling concrete, tangible problems but become paralyzed when faced with abstract, hypothetical, or complex situations requiring mental manipulation of concepts. These are not people with low intelligence. These are doctors, lawyers, engineers, parents, leaders, people who function perfectly well until a critical moment demands they think beyond what they can directly observe and manipulate. In that moment they fail, not because they lack information, but because their cognitive tools are insufficient for the problem at hand. Piaget documented a military case that became legendary in cognitive psychology circles, though it was rarely discussed outside academic settings because of its disturbing implications. During World War I, a battalion of troops was positioned to defend a strategic mountain pass. The commanding officer had extensive training, years of experience, and detailed maps of the terrain. Enemy forces were advancing, and the officer needed to make a decision about where to position his troops. The map showed 3 possible defensive positions, each with advantages and disadvantages depending on variables like weather, enemy numbers, and supply lines. The officer studied the maps for hours. He visited each position personally, examining the ground, the sight lines, the cover available. He gathered intelligence reports, consulted with his subordinates, and analyzed every tangible detail. But when the moment came to choose, he could not. He saw each position clearly in his concrete particulars, but he could not mentally simulate the different scenarios, could not hold multiple variables in his mind simultaneously, could not think through the abstract what-if questions that would allow him to project consequences. He was trapped in concrete observation, unable to perform the formal operational thinking required to navigate uncertainty. He chose based on which position looked most defensible when he stood in it, a concrete perceptual judgment, rather than an abstract strategic analysis. The enemy attacked from a direction he had considered impossible, because his mental simulation capabilities were insufficient to imagine their approach. The position was overrun, and most of the battalion was killed or captured, not because of enemy superiority, but because of a cognitive limitation in the commanding officer's thinking. Piaget interviewed the officer months later in a prisoner of war camp. The man was devastated, haunted by his failure, but he could not articulate what had gone wrong. He kept returning to the details, the maps, the terrain, the intelligence reports, as if reviewing the concrete facts would reveal his error. But Piaget recognized immediately that the error was not in the facts. The officer had all the information he needed. The error was in the cognitive architecture he brought to that information. He could observe, remember, and manipulate concrete objects and immediate perceptions brilliantly, but he could not construct abstract models, run mental simulations, or think hypothetically about scenarios that did not yet exist. This is the essence of concrete operational thinking meeting a problem that demands formal operational thinking, and it happens thousands of times every day in businesses, relationships, hospitals, and homes. People fail not because they are stupid, but because they are thinking with tools adequate for concrete problems but insufficient for abstract ones. The distinction Piaget drew was devastatingly precise. Concrete operational thinking allows you to solve problems involving tangible objects and direct observation. You can classify, sort, order, and manipulate things you can see and touch. You can follow logical rules applied to concrete situations. You can reverse operations mentally if they involve physical objects. This is sufficient for most daily tasks, which is why people can live entire lives functioning adequately without ever developing formal operational thinking. But formal operational thinking adds a completely different dimension. It allows you to reason about hypotheticals, to manipulate abstract concepts that have no physical form, to hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously and explore their interactions, to think about your own thinking and evaluate your cognitive processes, to construct systematic approaches to solving problems with unknown solutions. Without this capacity, you are perpetually reactive, responding to what is directly in front of you but unable to anticipate, plan, or navigate complexity that extends beyond immediate perception. Piaget identified specific markers of concrete operational thinking in adults, patterns that reveal when someone is trapped in this stage despite years of education and experience. The first marker is an inability to reason hypothetically. Ask a concrete operational thinker to consider what might happen if certain conditions were different, and they will struggle, often becoming frustrated or dismissive. They want to know what actually is, not what might be. They interpret requests to imagine possibilities as pointless speculation, rather than essential cognitive exercises. The second marker is difficulty with proportional reasoning and probability. They can understand that something is more or less likely, but they cannot quantify or compare probabilities systematically. They make decisions based on recent examples or vivid memories rather than statistical thinking. The third marker is literal interpretation of language and situations. They miss metaphors, struggle with irony, and interpret instructions in the most immediate surface-level way. The fourth marker is an inability to think systematically about problems with multiple interacting variables. They can handle one or two factors, But when three or more variables interact, their thinking becomes overwhelmed and chaotic. They resort to simplification, ignoring variables they cannot handle, rather than developing methods to track complexity. These markers appear most visibly in crisis situations because crisis demands exactly the kind of abstract, multivariable, hypothetical thinking that concrete operational thinking cannot provide. A parent whose teenager is struggling with depression can observe the symptoms, can remember similar situations from their own past, can apply concrete solutions like spending more time together or enforcing stricter rules. But if those concrete interventions fail, a parent trapped in concrete thinking becomes helpless. They cannot construct an abstract model of what depression is, cannot think systematically about the multiple factors contributing to it, cannot reason hypothetically about what different interventions might accomplish, and cannot evaluate their own thinking to recognize their cognitive limitations. They see their child suffering. They want desperately to help, but their cognitive tools are inadequate for the complexity of the problem. The result is escalating frustration, often expressed as anger at the child for not getting better, because concrete thinking interprets the continued problem as defiance or weakness, rather than as a signal that their approach is insufficient. In business, concrete operational thinking manifests as an inability to do strategic planning. A manager can handle daily operations brilliantly, solving immediate problems, coordinating tasks, managing people in face-to-face interactions. But ask that manager to develop a 3-year strategy, and they produce either a list of concrete actions with no coherent vision, or they become paralyzed, unable to bridge the gap between current reality and an abstract future state. They cannot hold the multiple variables of market conditions, competitor actions, internal capabilities, and technological change in mind simultaneously. They cannot reason hypothetically about different scenarios and their implications. They default to extrapolating current trends in a linear fashion, which works until it catastrophically does not. When their business fails, they blame external circumstances, bad luck, or other people, because their concrete thinking cannot recognize that the failure was in their cognitive approach to complexity. Here is where this becomes personal, where you need to pause and ask yourself a question that might be uncomfortable. Think about the last time you faced a truly complex decision, one where multiple factors were interacting and the outcome was uncertain. How did you approach it? Did you construct a systematic framework to think through the variables? Did you generate multiple hypothetical scenarios and reason through their implications? Did you recognize your own cognitive limitations and seek methods to extend your thinking? Or did you focus on the concrete details you could see, hoping that mastering the facts would reveal the answer? Did you feel overwhelmed by the complexity and simplify it, consciously or unconsciously, into something more manageable but less accurate? Did you make your decision based primarily on what felt right, what seemed most immediate, or what recent experiences suggested, rather than on systematic analysis of abstract patterns? If you recognize yourself in that second description, you are experiencing the limitations of concrete operational thinking in a situation demanding formal operations. This does not mean you are unintelligent. It means your cognitive development stopped at a stage that is insufficient for the complexity of the modern world you are navigating. I know how this feels because I have watched brilliant people I respect and admire, hit this wall and not understand why they keep failing. They blame circumstances, other people, bad timing, anything but the architecture of their own thinking. And the tragic part is that they cannot see it, because recognizing your own cognitive limitations requires exactly the kind of abstract, self-reflective thinking that concrete operations do not provide. It is like asking someone to see their own blind spot, not the one in your peripheral vision that you know exists, but a blind spot in your thinking itself. So if any of what I have described resonates with you, if you feel that frustration of knowing something is not working but not being able to grasp what, leave a simple comment. Just write, "I have felt this before." Your experience can be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone. You have more power to help others than you imagine, just by acknowledging what is true for you. The beautiful and hopeful part of Piaget's work is that he did not believe these stages were fixed or permanent. He believed that cognitive development could continue throughout life, that adults could develop formal operational thinking, even if they had not during adolescence. But it required specific kinds of experiences and practices, not just more education or information. It required being placed in situations that demanded thinking beyond concrete operations, situations where concrete thinking failed, and where feedback revealed the inadequacy clearly. It required being taught not just what to think, but how to think about thinking itself. Metacognitive skills that allow you to observe and modify your own cognitive processes. And it required systematic practice in the specific skills that constitute formal operational thinking, generating and testing hypotheses, reasoning about abstract concepts, manipulating multiple variables simultaneously, thinking systematically rather than reactively, and reflecting on one's own cognitive processes. Piaget identified 4 types of cognitive challenges that specifically develop formal operational thinking, and each type addresses a different aspect of the transition from concrete to abstract thought. Type 1 is combinatorial reasoning, the ability to systematically generate all possible combinations of variables rather than considering them haphazardly. Imagine you are trying to understand what factors influence a plant's growth: water, sunlight, soil type, temperature, and fertilizer. A concrete thinker will try different combinations randomly, based on intuition or recent experience, and will often miss important interactions because they are not systematic. Formal operational thinking requires you to generate all possible combinations methodically, test them systematically, and track results in a way that reveals patterns. This is not natural or intuitive. It requires practice and often external tools like charts or matrices to organize the thinking. But developing this capability transforms how you approach any complex problem with multiple factors. Type 2 is proportional reasoning, the ability to think about relationships between variables that change in coordinated ways. A concrete thinker understands more and less, bigger and smaller, but struggles with relationships like if X doubles, Y increases by 50%. This sounds mathematical, but it appears everywhere in daily life. Understanding how your actions affect other people's responses, how market changes affect business outcomes, how lifestyle factors interact to influence health, all require proportional reasoning. Without it, you see events as discrete and disconnected rather than as part of systems where changes propagate through multiple levels. Developing proportional reasoning requires practice with problems where you explicitly track how changes in one variable produce changes in another, building a mental library of common patterns like linear relationships, inverse relationships, exponential growth, and diminishing returns. These patterns become templates that allow you to understand new situations more quickly and accurately. Type 3 is the ability to isolate variables and conduct controlled experiments, mentally or actually. A concrete thinker trying to solve a problem will change multiple things at once and then not know which change produced any observed effect. They operate by trial and error in an unsystematic way. Formal operational thinking requires you to hold most variables constant while changing one, observing the effect and drawing conclusions about causation rather than just correlation. This is the foundation of scientific thinking, but it applies to every domain. If you are trying to improve a relationship, you need to change one behavior at a time and observe effects systematically. If you are trying to grow a business, you need to test variables independently, rather than changing everything simultaneously and hoping for the best. This capacity for systematic hypothesis testing transforms you from someone who reacts to outcomes into someone who understands and can control the processes producing those outcomes. Type 4 is reflective abstraction, Piaget's term for thinking about your own thinking. This is the highest and most difficult form of formal operational thinking because it requires you to observe your cognitive processes while you are using them, to recognize patterns in how you think, to identify your biases and limitations, and to modify your thinking strategies based on that awareness. A concrete thinker is embedded in their thoughts, experiencing them as reality rather than as constructions their mind is creating. Formal operational thinking creates distance between you and your thoughts, allowing you to evaluate them, question them, and improve them. This is not just introspection or self-reflection in the general sense. It is specific analysis of how you are approaching a problem, whether that approach is working, what assumptions you are making, what alternatives exist, and how to shift to a more effective cognitive strategy. Developing reflective abstraction requires practice in deliberately pausing during problem solving to ask metacognitive questions. What am I assuming right now? What would have to be true for this approach to work? What am I not considering? How else could I think about this? Piaget documented case after case of adults who transformed their lives by developing these capacities, but the pattern was always the same. They hit a crisis that concrete thinking could not solve. They recognized their inadequacy. They sought out specific training in formal operational thinking, and they practiced systematically until new cognitive patterns became automatic. One case involved a surgeon who was technically brilliant at procedures, but could not diagnose complex cases where symptoms were ambiguous and multiple conditions might be interacting. He could see what was directly in front of him, could follow established protocols perfectly. But when a patient presented with an unusual combination of symptoms, he became paralyzed. He would order more tests, hoping the concrete data would reveal an obvious answer, but he could not construct abstract models of what might be happening and reason through them hypothetically. After a misdiagnosis that nearly killed a patient, he sought out training in clinical reasoning. He learned to generate multiple hypotheses simultaneously, to think systematically about how different diseases would produce different patterns of symptoms, to use probabilistic reasoning to evaluate which diagnosis was most likely, and to reflect on his own thinking process to catch errors early. This was not about learning more medicine, he already knew the medicine. This was about developing cognitive tools that allowed him to apply his knowledge effectively in complex situations. Within 2 years, he became one of the best diagnosticians in his hospital, known for solving cases other doctors found impossible, not because he was smarter, but because he had developed formal operational thinking in a domain where he had previously been trapped in concrete operations. Another case involved a woman in her 40s who had successfully raised 3 children, but found herself unable to handle her aging parents who were developing dementia. She could manage concrete tasks like scheduling doctor's appointments and organizing medications, but she could not think systematically about the multiple factors affecting her parents' quality of life and make strategic decisions about their care. She felt overwhelmed, trapped, reacting to crises rather than anticipating them. She could see that her approach was not working, but she could not figure out what to do differently. A social worker recognized the pattern and taught her basic systems thinking, showing her how to map the multiple variables affecting her parents' situation, how to think hypothetically about different care options and their implications, and how to evaluate her own thinking to recognize when she was oversimplifying complexity. These cognitive tools did not make the situation less difficult, but they transformed her experience from helpless overwhelm to strategic competence. She could think clearly about impossibly complex decisions because she had developed the cognitive architecture those decisions required. The dangers of remaining trapped in concrete operational thinking become more severe as the world increases in complexity. Piaget wrote about this in his later work, warning that modern society was creating problems that demanded formal operational thinking from larger and larger percentages of the population, but educational systems were still primarily developing concrete operational thinking. He argued that this mismatch would create widespread feelings of inadequacy, anxiety, and failure, not because people lacked ability, but because they lacked the specific cognitive development needed for the problems they faced. This was in the 1960s and 1970s, and he predicted that the problem would intensify. He was correct. Today, almost every job requires some level of abstract thinking, strategic planning, and ability to handle complexity. Relationships demand understanding of psychological dynamics and emotional patterns that are entirely abstract. Parenting requires thinking systematically about child development and long-term outcomes. Health requires understanding complex interactions between genetics, lifestyle, environment, and medical interventions. Financial planning requires probabilistic reasoning and long-term projection. Citizens are expected to evaluate complex policy questions involving multiple interacting economic, social, and environmental factors, and people are facing all of this with cognitive tools that were adequate for concrete problems, but are insufficient for abstract complexity. The result is exactly what Piaget predicted: widespread anxiety, depression, and sense of failure. People feel stupid when they are not stupid. They feel overwhelmed when the problem is not the amount of work but the cognitive approach they are bringing to it. They feel trapped when the cage is not external circumstances but the architecture of their own thinking. And they often cope by avoiding complexity, simplifying problems in ways that make them manageable but inaccurate, or by following authority figures who claim to have simple answers to complex questions. None of these strategies solve the underlying problem. They are all ways of protecting concrete operational thinking from situations that reveal its inadequacy. The only real solution is to develop the cognitive capacities that complexity demands, and Piaget provided a map for how to do that. His process for developing formal operational thinking has 3 phases, and each phase requires you to step outside your cognitive comfort zone in specific ways. Phase 1 is recognizing your current limitations. This sounds simple, but it is devastatingly difficult because your thinking feels transparent to you. It feels like you are simply perceiving reality, rather than constructing an interpretation through cognitive processes. You have to create distance between yourself and your thoughts, and that requires deliberate practice. The technique Piaget recommended was to take problems you have already solved and examine how you solved them. What did you consider? What did you ignore? What assumptions did you make? What would you have seen if you had approached the problem differently? This retrospective analysis trains you to observe your thinking as an object rather than being embedded in it. As you practice this, you start to notice patterns in how you think, and you start to recognize moments when your thinking is inadequate for the problem at hand. This awareness is uncomfortable because it reveals that your cognitive confidence was often misplaced. But it is essential because you cannot develop capacities you do not know you lack. Phase 2 is systematic practice, with increasingly complex problems that demand skills you do not yet have. This cannot be passive learning, reading books or watching videos. It must be active problem solving where you construct solutions, receive feedback about whether your thinking was adequate, and adjust your approach. Piaget emphasized that the problems must be at the edge of your capacity, difficult enough to require new cognitive strategies, but not so overwhelming that you shut down. He called this the zone of proximal development, borrowing from Vygotsky, and he insisted that growth happens only in this zone. Too easy and you are just applying existing patterns. Too hard and you cannot construct the cognitive bridges needed. The art is finding problems that stretch you, that demand you think in ways that are not yet automatic, and staying with them long enough to develop new patterns. This is frustrating, often deeply frustrating, because you feel incompetent in areas where you want to feel competent. But that frustration is the signal that you are actually developing, that your brain is building new neural pathways, that your cognitive architecture is expanding. The key is interpreting the frustration correctly, not as evidence of your inadequacy, but as evidence of your growth. Phase 3 is reflective integration, taking the new thinking patterns you are developing and consciously incorporating them into your identity and your automatic approaches. This is where most people fail, even when they have developed new capacities, because they revert to old patterns under stress or time pressure. New thinking requires conscious effort until it becomes automatic, and that transition takes extended practice. Piaget recommended keeping a thinking journal where you record not what you did, but how you thought about what you did, analyzing your cognitive process and identifying where you used new strategies and where you fell back on old ones. Over time, this reflective practice makes formal operational thinking your default rather than something you have to consciously invoke. You start to automatically generate multiple hypotheses, think systematically about variables, reason probabilistically, and reflect on your own thinking. At that point, problems that used to paralyze you become interesting puzzles, complexity that used to overwhelm you becomes engaging challenge, and you experience a fundamental shift in your sense of capability and confidence. The transformation is profound, but it is not instantaneous. Piaget was clear that cognitive development takes time, often years, and that there are no shortcuts. You cannot read your way to formal operational thinking. You cannot take a course that gives it to you. You have to build it through sustained practice and reflection, the same way you built every other cognitive capacity you have. But the difference is that this time you are doing it consciously. You are directing your own development rather than waiting for it to happen accidentally through life experiences. And that makes all the difference because you can be systematic, you can target the specific capacities you need most, and you can accelerate development that might otherwise take decades or might never happen at all. Think back to that commanding officer studying his maps, trapped in concrete observation while the decision he needed to make demanded abstract simulation. That moment of paralysis, that inability to bridge the gap between what he could see and what he needed to imagine, that is the moment when cognitive architecture determines outcomes. And that moment happens to you, to all of us, whenever the problem we face exceeds the thinking tools we have developed. The question is not whether you will face such moments. You will. The question is what you will do when you recognize that your thinking is inadequate. Will you blame circumstances, other people, bad luck? Will you simplify the problem to make it fit your current cognitive tools? Or will you recognize that the problem is revealing an opportunity, that your inadequacy is not permanent, that you can develop the capacities complexity demands if you are willing to do the work? Piaget spent his life documenting that development is possible, that the human mind can continue growing throughout life if given the right challenges and the right support. But he also emphasized that it is not automatic, that millions of people plateau at concrete operations and never develop the formal thinking that modern life demands. The difference between those who continue developing and those who plateau is not intelligence or talent. It is recognition that their current thinking is insufficient, willingness to feel incompetent while building new capacities, and commitment to systematic practice over extended time. These are choices, not gifts. These are decisions you make about how you will respond when complexity overwhelms you. You are not stuck with the thinking tools you have right now. You are capable of developing formal operational thinking that transforms how you navigate complexity, make decisions, solve problems, and understand yourself and others. But you have to want it enough to do the work, to step outside your cognitive comfort zone, to practice skills that feel unnatural at first, and to persist through the frustration that signals growth. Piaget gave us the map. He showed us exactly what those cognitive capacities are, how they develop, and what practices build them. The map is there. The path is clear. The only question is whether you will walk it. If you found yourself recognizing patterns in this exploration, if something resonated with your own experience of feeling overwhelmed by complexity or paralyzed in critical moments, you have taken the first step, which is awareness. You are no longer unconsciously embedded in your thinking. You are starting to create the distance that allows observation and choice. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation everything else builds on. You are part of a community of people who are committed to continuing their own development, who refuse to accept that their current limitations are permanent, who understand that the most valuable skill in an increasingly complex world is the ability to think about thinking itself. I invite you to continue discovering what is possible when you develop the cognitive architecture that complexity demands. Subscribe to keep exploring these insights together, because this is just the beginning. There is so much more to uncover about how your mind works and how you can direct its growth. The button is your first step toward that transformation, toward becoming someone who meets complexity with confidence rather than fear, who navigates uncertainty with clarity rather than paralysis, and who understands that your thinking is not fixed, but is always, always capable of growth. In our next exploration, we will examine Piaget's most controversial discovery, the finding that shattered his relationship with the educational establishment and changed how we understand learning itself. The discovery that most education is actively preventing the cognitive development it claims to foster, and what you can do about it if you are serious about continuing your growth. The story begins with a simple question Piaget asked in a Swiss kindergarten, a question that seemed innocent until the answer revealed something so disturbing about how we teach children to think that school systems tried to silence him. That exploration is waiting for you, and it will challenge everything you thought you knew about learning and intelligence. I will see you there, and together, We will keep uncovering the architecture of human potential that Piaget spent his life mapping.